I will be talking about the Environmental Protection Agency, which is an agency of the United States federal government whose mission is to protect human and environmental health. They're responsible for creating standards and laws that promote the health of individuals and the environment. I will be refuting the claim that Scott Pruitt, the current director of the EPA, is failing to promote a cleaner and healthier environment for the American people. I aim to refute this claim by addressing the inaccuracy of the supporting claims my opponent has made. There are two secondary claims. The first claim is that Scott Pruitt is more interested in business rather than the environment. And then the second claim is that Scott Pruitt is being lobbied by the fossil fuel industry. I will refute the first claim that Scott Pruitt is more interested in business rather than the environment. My opponent stated that Scott Pruitt is a climate change denier despite the overwhelming consensus, and then used a quote from a 2016 conservative magazine article that stated that the debate of climate change is far from settled. However, him saying that the debate is far from settled doesn't mean he's denying climate change. It just means he's open to different viewpoints. So the accusation hurled at Scott Pruitt is false. He hasn't done anything to discourage peer review. In fact, he's done the opposite. He has called for the use of more independent experts to review the EPA's research and announced that the agency relies on studies for which data are available to be shared. Claiming that he's a climate change denier is denouncing these moves as an attack on science. He has proposed an analysis of climate change using a red team / blue team, which is an innovative technique to draw up plans that will create solutions. Also, in an interview with CNN, he states that climate change is a reality and humans have contributed to it to a certain degree, which shows him acknowledging that climate change does exist. My opponent also makes another point where he uses an example of the Clean Power Plan proposed by EPA in 2015 when Scott Pruitt was an Oklahoma attorney, where he sued the EPA multiple times. The National Review article stated that EPA relied on controversial claim that a particular form of air pollution was responsible for premature deaths. To reach this conclusion, the American Council of Science and Health ignored this evidence and chose to rely on a 1999 research whose methodology and conclusions were open to question. Because EPA refused to share this data, as reason Scott Pruitt sued the EPA, which refutes the point of him being more interested in business than the environment. The second point I'll refute is that Scott Pruitt is being lobbied by the fossil industry. My opponent stated that the emails released show his ties with the fossil fuel industry. However, the emails provide a unique perspective into Pruitt's priorities and concerns on environmental and other legal matters. My opponent's example of the multiple emails, he said that there was multiple emails shared with Pruitt and Devon Energy, and according to Washington Post, there were emails discussing drafts letters for Scott Pruitt to send to the EPA discussing regulations of methane emissions. However, according to a Times article, Pruitt's work at the EPA is part of the Trump administration's larger project of rolling back decades of regulations across the government, and Pruitt's quest to remake the agency has gotten pushback from all sides. Therefore, all blame cannot be placed on Scott Pruitt. Another point that my opponent made is that Scott Pruitt received multiple donations from major oil and gas companies, electricity providers, coal producers, and conservative think tanks, which shows that most of his political career is being funded by these giant corporations. However, he's also denied donations. In an article with the New York Times, rather than push for a federal judge to push the companies by extracting perhaps tens of millions of dollars in damages, he quietly negotiated a deal to simply study environmental problems further. It was one of a series on instances where Mr. Pruitt put a corporation with industry before confrontation as he sought to blunt the impact of federal environmental policies in his state, which in many ways defines his tenure as Oklahoma's Attorney General. The points that I've refuted is that Scott Pruitt is more interested in business rather than the environment, and that Scott Pruitt is being lobbied by the fossil fuel industry. Thank you.
All right, everything's easy to follow. On the first point, I think that you've got directly contradictory arguments on the issue of the climate change point, suggesting that the EPA Director Scott Pruitt has not in fact denied climate change, but rather has suggested that there is room for study, suggesting that there are better ways to look at this problem and address it, suggesting that in fact that the climate has changed and it is a reality that human beings have contributed to it. So the only thing that seems to be in dispute is how much and what we can do about it, which is what the advocate, which I assume is what Pruitt thinks that we ought to be researching. The other argument that they used, the particular example about the power plant action that was being talked about in Oklahoma, there's a good piece of information that you've got here that suggests that there was a legitimate reason that the Attorney General of Oklahoma is protesting this thing, suggesting that it was based on data that is not reliable, that the EPA was not transparent in how they utilized that information, and that there was a legitimate reason to believe that this was going to be problematic, which does not necessarily show that Pruitt is antithetical to having clean air, but rather wants to make sure that the rules are being followed, which is, one of those things that lawyers do. They get into that sort of thing. So I thought you had a pretty strong response on the first point. On the second point, I don't think it's quite as strong. The suggestion is that the fossil fuel industry dominates his career. I did like the idea that there's this general concept that you have at the end that he is pursuing cooperation rather than confrontation, but there ought to be some demonstration that that cooperation has gotten some kind of result, and I'm not sure that we get that sort of thing. The notion, the first part of the argument seems to suggest that it's not necessarily Pruitt's desire to roll this back, that it is in fact a long-term goal of the Trump administration. So laying it on the head of Pruitt alone, I'm not sure that gives you a lot, but I understand the desire to make the argument because it does suggest like there's another causality that's going on here. All right, thank you all very much for your patience tonight.